What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about the bounce back players in fantasy hockey. These are players that underperformed last season for a variety of reasons, but I think they have a strong case to bounce back, which means they could be very good value in your upcoming drafts. For this video, we're putting a heavy emphasis on advanced stats and data to help us determine whether a player is going to bounce back. These advanced stats include shooting percentage, on-ice shooting percentage, individual points percentage, ICF per 60, and ISCF per 60. By comparing players' numbers in these stats from last season to previous seasons and also their career average, we can lay the foundation as to whether they have a good chance of bouncing back or not. But that being said, before we talk about the bounce back candidates, I want to give you guys a brief overview of these advanced stats and what they mean. This will help you guys understand why we use these advanced stats to determine impending regression, whether that be positive or negative. The first stat I want to talk about is shooting percentage. No, it's not really an advanced stat, but it's one of, if not the most important stat for fantasy hockey. The definition of shooting percentage is the percentage of shots on goal that go in the net, calculated as goals divided by shots on goal. The reason why we use shooting percentage as a metric to determine whether a player is going to regress positively or negatively is because generally, shooting percentages regress to the mean. What this means is that typically over the course of a player's career, we do see outlier shooting percentages, whether that be super high or super low, and generally, this shooting percentage returns to what they normally average. Using these outlier seasons, we can figure out which players are due to bounce back or negatively regress. Take Austin Matthews, for example. In 22-23, Matthews scored 40 goals in 74 games with a 12.2% shooting percentage. This was the lowest shooting percentage of his entire career and much lower than his 15.7% career average at the time. There was no guarantee that he was going to bounce back, but it is a good indication that this goal scoring from the 22-23 season was not sustainable and he was due to score more goals. We saw this last season. He bounced back. He scored 69 goals with an 18.7% shooting percentage. We can also take Nugent Hopkins as an example. In 22-23, he had an incredible year. He had 104 points in 82 games, and 37 of these points were goals. Unfortunately, his shooting percentage that season was 18.4%. That was a career high for Nugent Hopkins, and this was unsustainable. We ultimately saw this regression last year. He put up 67 points in 80 games, and only 18 of these points were goals. Now, the last thing I want to say about shot percentage is that just because a player had a lower shooting percentage than their career average doesn't necessarily guarantee that they are going to bounce back. It also doesn't mean that a player with a high shooting percentage is due to negatively regress. However, generally speaking, there is a clear pattern. Shooting percentages regress to the mean. With all that being said, when researching players to draft, take a look at their most recent shooting percentage. Was it way higher than their career average? Was it way lower? You have to take this into account when drafting players to determine whether there could be impending regression. The fact is, there is a good chance that an outlier shooting percentage is unsustainable, so draft accordingly. The next advanced stat I want to talk about is IPP, which stands for individual points percentage. The definition of IPP is a percentage of goals that a player got a point on that were scored while he was on the ice. For example, if a player has an IPP of 75%, that means that they got a point on 3 of every 4 goals that were scored while he was on the ice. You can use IPP as a luck metric. If a player has an outlier IPP compared to previous seasons, whether that be positive or negative, you can use this to determine impending regression. What I do want to say about IPP is that there are a couple of caveats, one of them being that if a player has a high IPP, then that doesn't necessarily mean regression. A high IPP could mean regression, but it could also mean that a player is far more skilled than their line mates. You saw this with Connor Bedard, who had a very high IPP last year. Could that mean regression? Yes, but it could also just mean that he was playing on a line with Ryan Donato and Philip Kurashev. You could also see a high IPP if you find highly skilled players playing on the 3rd or 4th line and therefore playing against weaker competition. On the flip side, if a player has a lower IPP than they did in previous seasons, that could mean regression, but it could also mean that they were moved up to a top line and are therefore playing harder competition. It could also mean that their line mates are more skilled, so yes, their IPP is going to be lower. With that being said, context is important when discussing IPP, but still, we can look at it and use it as a luck metric. The next advanced stat I want to talk about is on-ice shooting percentage. The definition of on-ice shooting percentage is the number of goals scored while on the ice divided by the number of shots taken while on the ice. The difference between shooting percentage and on-ice shooting percentage is that on-ice counts all shots taken at the opponent's net when a player is on the ice. That includes those by his teammates. This is useful because it not only takes the player's shooting percentage into account, but also his teammates. Were they overperforming? Were they underperforming? This will help us figure out if that player is due for some impending regression. Like with IPP and shooting percentage, you want to compare the stat to a player's previous seasons rather than comparing it to other players. To give you guys an example of unsustainable high on-ice shooting percentage, we can look at a player like JT Miller. Last season, he had a 15.6% on-ice shooting percentage compared to the previous 3 seasons, which was 12.55%. This is problematic for JT Miller, and I do think that he is going to regress for this upcoming year. You can also take a look at Tyler Seguin. He had a 13.03% on-ice shooting percentage last season compared to a 9.66% on-ice shooting percentage in the last 3 years. On the flip side, you can look at a player with a low on-ice shooting percentage. Trevor Zegras is a player that had an 8.30% on-ice shooting percentage last season, and that was compared to a 10.5% on-ice shooting percentage in the last 3 seasons. In conclusion, I like looking at on-ice shooting percentage. It's one of these stats that is another luck metric, and it can help us determine whether a player is going to regress negatively or positively. Those are all the advanced stats I wanted to talk about today, and I hope that it gives you a good understanding when I'm discussing them in this video. With that being said, feel free to take a look at Natural Stat Trick. That's a database that I use for this video. You can look at a player's advanced statistics on there, and that will help you determine whether a player's recent production is sustainable or not. Before we talk about the players, guys, I just want to say rest in peace to Johnny Gaudreau and Matthew Gaudreau. Terrible tragedy. Not really a lot to say here other than it's very depressing. Johnny was supposed to be on this list as a bounce back player, so I thought I would just show his slide here. I thought he was due for a big bounce back season this year. So yeah, just wanted to say that. Obviously, thoughts and prayers for all the families involved. And I just wanted to show you the GoFundMe for Matthew Gaudreau's wife, Madeline, and her baby Tripp. If you guys want to support that, the link is in the description. But yeah, rest in peace to those guys. And let's start talking about the bounce back players. The first bounce back player on this list is none other than Barrett Hayton of the Utah Hockey Club. Now, some of you OGs may know I liked Barrett Hayton last year. I did. I talked about him as a massive sleeper in fantasy hockey, and he was terrible. He had 10 points in 33 games. It was a bad pick, but things this year could be very different. And let me break down the case for Barrett Hayton to bounce back. First, let's look at some of the advanced stats. He had a 4.5% shooting percentage last year compared to a 9.6% career average. This is not sustainable. I expect some positive regression here. This is going to regress to the mean, and we're going to see some better goal scoring out of Hayton. We can also look at individual point percentage too, both 5v5 and on the power play, and they were both much lower than the previous 3 years. This is specifically highlighted for the power play IPP, which is only 13.33 compared to a 42.86 IPP in the previous 3 seasons. I understand that Hayton gets the least amount of touches on the power play, but that type of low power play IPP is not sustainable, so I'm expecting him to get more luck on the man advantage. With that being said, yes, the advanced stats suggest he is going to bounce back, but we have to look at some other factors too, which tell me that he's going to be pretty good value in some deeper leagues. The main thing that makes me really like Barrett Hayton as a sleeper and also his bounce back potential is that he is likely still going to be on the first line and the first line power play. Last season, Hayton averaged 17 minutes of ice time per game and 2 minutes and 31 seconds of power play time per game, which is very solid, and I'm expecting very similar deployment. The fact is that Keller, Hayton, and Schmaltz have had very good chemistry in the past, specifically in the 22-23 season, where Hayton was putting up stellar numbers in the second half of that year. Just look at some of the game logs here for that year when he was playing on the first line with Schmaltz and Keller. He was absolutely incredible, and same with Keller and Schmaltz. They were producing at an elite level, and they were one of the best lines in the NHL. They are not going to give up on Barrett Hayton just yet, and they are going to try to recreate this magic once again. There's no guarantee it happens, but they have chemistry, and I'm expecting this first line to stay intact. To my understanding, Utah is going to run a 1-3-1 power play, and like most power plays in the NHL, they have a player screening the goalie as a net front player. This role on the power play involves deflecting pucks, screening the goalie, cleaning up the garbage, getting rebounds, and Barrett Hayton has been a staple on this role in the last couple of seasons. Hayton's 6'1", he's almost 210 pounds, and he has been good in this role, and they have to have somebody fill that role on the power play. So ultimately, with Hayton likely playing even strength with Keller, he's likely going to be on the first unit as well. When Barrett Hayton was healthy last year, he was on this first unit, and I expect him to stay on this first unit because they need somebody in that role, and the only other competition for that role is Alex Kerfoot. Some people may disagree that Hayton's going to be on the first unit and they think Cooley's going to be on the first unit, but if you watch my power play video, you understand that there is not a fit for Cooley to be on this first unit because he naturally plays in Keller's spot. In my opinion, if Logan Cooley's on this first unit, it's not going to be taking Hayton off. It's going to be taking Nick Schmaltz off. What they would probably do is move Cooley to the left side, have Gunther in the bumper, Keller on the right side, and then they would still need a net front player. So yeah, I think Hayton, his deployment is pretty secure this season, being on the first line and the first line power play. And on a team that had a top 15 power play last season, that's pretty solid. In conclusion, the advanced stats suggest he's going to bounce back. back. His deployment looks really good right now. He puts up good peripherals. Like, he takes a lot of shots. Hits and blocks are okay, but the shots is what I like. And he's on a team that could improve from last year and potentially be a playoff team as well. So yeah, I think Hayton is definitely a bounce back candidate, and I think he is going to be a big sleeper in some deeper leagues. The next bounce back player on this list is Kent Johnson of the Columbus Blue Jackets. Johnson had a disappointing season last year, only putting up 16 points in 42 games, and also spending time playing in the AHL. So yeah, it was tough, especially because the year prior, he put up 40 points in 79 games in his rookie year. One thing I do want to highlight though is that in the 10 games that he played in the AHL, he did put up 15 points, which was 5th in points per game. Very small sample size, but he can produce, guys. There's no question about it. And if you don't know, Ken Johnson, he was drafted 5th overall in the 2021 NHL entry draft. So he was drafted with high capital, and a lot of people have had lofty expectations about what he can do in the NHL. The good thing is that Johnson is only 21 years old. He still has a ton of potential, and this season could be a massive opportunity for him to showcase his abilities. Now listen, I do have to talk about the lines for the Blue Jackets. I understand this Gaudreau passing is still very fresh, but as a fantasy hockey analyst, I still have to give you guys the information on how to proceed with your draft. So with Kent Johnson, we do have to recognize that there is a chance that he is on the first line this year. I don't want to get too much into it, and I feel like I keep re-recording this part because I don't want to say the wrong thing. But yes, he has an opportunity for top 6 minutes and increased power play time this season. So yeah, there could be a huge bump in deployment, especially considering last season, if you're looking at his deployment, he only averaged 13 minutes and 33 seconds of ice time per game. It's pretty clear that Johnson's going to see a bump in even strength ice time, but with power play time, I'm not so sure. If I were to project the power play lines today, I would say Fantilli is probably replacing Gaudreau on this first unit, but if it's not Fantilli, it's going to be Kent Johnson. I think it will be Fantilli, but Johnson certainly has a possibility to get on this first unit, so that is definitely something you guys need to consider heading into your drafts. Putting that aside, if we take a look at his advanced stats, we can also see that his shooting percentage last year was pretty low. His on-ice shooting percentage was much lower than his first 2 seasons, and also his power play IPP was 0. In his rookie season where he put up 40 points, like I mentioned, 12 of those came from the man advantage. So I'm expecting him to get back to putting up some power play points, whether he's on the first unit or the second unit. In conclusion, there's a very good chance that Johnson's either on the first or the second line even strength, and he also has an opportunity to get on the first power play unit as well. So he definitely has some upside, and his advanced stats suggest to me that he should bounce back too. I will warn you that Johnson puts up really bad shots, hits, and blocks. So in a category league or a points league that values those, he is going to be at a massive disadvantage, but we have to recognize that there is a chance he could put up 50 plus points for this upcoming season. The next bounce back player I want to talk about is Tom Wilson of the Washington Capitals. Wilson didn't have a great season last year, only putting up 35 points in 74 games, but we do have to recognize that that was his lowest point pace since the 2016-2017 season. If we look at the Capitals lines, there's not a lot of competition on the right wing, so there is a good chance that Tom Wilson is playing on the top line with Alex Ovechkin. I am also expecting Wilson to be on this first line power play as the bumper player, and that power play is probably going to be Pierre-Luc Dubois in that front. We're going to have Ovechkin in his office on the left side, Dylan Strome on the right side, and then John Karlsson running the point. Now, Wilson is not guaranteed to be on this first unit, but I think he makes the most sense in the bumper as a right-handed player, being able to feed Ovi from that spot, being a big body who can screen the goalie and also get those deflections. So in general, I think Wilson's going to be on this first unit. I also think he's going to be on the first line, if not in the top 6. So the deployment is great. Is Wilson going to get a lot of touches on the power play? No, but he has that power play point potential that some other players don't. Another thing I want to mention is that if you don't know, Wilson is an absolute beast when it comes to putting up hits. If you're in a category league that counts hits or a points league that counts hits, then Wilson is going to be an absolute stud regardless of his production. He's also a guy that puts up really good blocks for a forward as well, so he has that baked in, and his shots are decent too. So you have that safe floor baked in, you have the deployment, and you have this bounce back potential based on his advanced stats. Wilson had his lowest shooting percentage since the 2016-2017 season, so I'm expecting him to put up more goals this year. I'm expecting that to regress to the mean. I also want to highlight his on-ice shooting percentage here. It was 8.61% compared to 12.75% in the last 3 seasons. Yes, this was some regression because 12.75% for on-ice shooting percentage is high, but 8.61 is much lower than what we normally see out of Tom Wilson. So yes, I expect Tom Wilson to put up more goals. I'm expecting him to put up more points, and I think think in any league that counts hits, he is going to be great value in your upcoming drafts. The next bounce back player I want to talk about is Trevor Zegras of the Anaheim Ducks. Zegras had a terrible season last year. He only played 31 games because he missed most of the season due to injury, but in those 31 games, he only put up 6 goals and a total of 15 points. Now, I do want to get a couple of negatives about Zegras out of the way before I talk about his bounce back potential. One being that his shots, hits, and blocks are not good at all. If you're in a category league or a points league that values shots, hits, and blocks, then yes, he is going to be at a disadvantage. The second thing I want to say is that the Ducks don't have a great offense. They don't have a great power play. Yes, I'm expecting this offense to improve, but their power play percentage is probably not going to be in the top 20. So because of that, his ceiling is capped. Another thing to mention about this power play is that there is a very good chance that they distribute the usage evenly for both units, which also caps Zegras' ceiling. With that out of the way, I want to tell you guys why I think Zegras is going to bounce back, and also why, if you're in a league that doesn't heavily value shots, hits, or blocks, he could be really good value. One, his shooting percentage. It was 8.2% compared to 11.2% career average. So I expect that to bounce back and regress to the mean. His on-ice shooting percentage was 8.30% compared to 10.50% in the last 3 seasons. So I'm also expecting this to bounce back. That will help his goal scoring. And then his IPP on the power play was only 25 compared to a 70.83 IPP in the last 3 years. All this suggests to me that Zegras was unlucky last year, and there is a good chance that he bounces back. We also have to mention that Zegras may have been playing games banged up last year, so this season he should be healthy, and that will help his production. We also have to talk about the fact that the Ducks are going to be a better team than last season. Last season, Erik Karlsson only played half of the games due to load management. Zegras was injured, Kaloran got injured, and this season you're likely going to have better health. You're going to have Karlsson playing a full 82 games, and you're going to have Mintukov potentially stepping up. You're going to have Zellweger with the team full time. You have Cutter Gauthier with the team full time, and you have a bunch of young players in general that could be poised to break out. So with all that being said, the Ducks are likely going to improve, and that is going to help Trevor Zegras' fantasy outlook. Zegras put up 61 points in 21-22. He put up 65 points in 22-23, and we do have to remember that he is only 23 years old, so there could be more things to come. In conclusion, yes, Zegras' ceiling is capped being on the Ducks. Yes, he doesn't put up the best shots, hits, or blocks, but I fully expect him to bounce back this season, and I fully expect him to be a value in your upcoming drafts. The next player that I expect to bounce back for this upcoming season is Matty Beniers of the Seattle Kraken. Beniers won the Calder Trophy in 2022-2023. He had a fantastic rookie season, putting up 57 points in 80 games, but unfortunately last year he went through what we know as a sophomore slump. In 77 games last year, he only put up 37 points, so in most fantasy hockey leagues, he was not good. The good thing is that Beniers is only 21 years old, and if you look at his advanced stats, there is a good indication that he should bounce back. I know we don't have the biggest sample size to look at with Beniers, but his shooting percentage last year was 11.3% compared to a 14% career average. His on-ice shooting percentage last year was 9.19% compared to the previous 2 seasons, which was 12.69%. Now, could this have been regression from his first 2 years in the NHL? Yes. That is a possibility. I want to say that, but I do think it's a good indication of him bouncing back. And in my opinion, a guy that's going to be the first line center on a team with a decent offense is going to put up more than 37 points this year. Beniers had 17 minutes and 58 seconds of ice time per game last year, 2 minutes and 30 seconds of that coming from the man advantage, and I'm expecting similar deployment for this year. That deployment is very solid, although, like I've mentioned in previous videos, the Kraken tend to run distributed usage for both of their power play units, which does cap Beniers' ceiling. You're probably not seeing 3+ minutes of power play time for Beniers, which does suck, but there is a small chance it does happen with a new coaching staff, with Dan Bylsma coming in replacing Haxtell. So that is something to consider, but in general, just with their roster construction, I'm expecting them to do the same thing. Nonetheless, Beniers is going to be centering the first line. He's going to be getting solid power play time, even though they're not running a dedicated first unit, and the advanced stats that we see here should point to him bouncing back. Beniers is a player that you're going to be able to get super late in drafts, or even potentially pick him up off the waiver wire as well. So he's going to be good value. I'm expecting him to bounce back, and I'm excited to see what he can do for this upcoming season. The next bounce back player on this list is Jake Debrusk, who is now on the Vancouver Canucks. I had Debrusk pinned as a sleeper last year, but he definitely had a disappointing season. He only put up 40 points in 80 games. He didn't get a lot of power play time either. So yeah, it was tough for Debrusk, but he is on a new team now in a new situation, and I think there's a lot of upside. Now, I talked about Debrusk in my offseason riser video, so you may have heard these talking points already, but the reason I like Debrusk is because on the Canucks, there's not a lot of competition. Debrusk could easily be the best left wing on the Canucks, because if you're looking at their lines, The only other competition for minutes on the left side is with Höglander and Dakota Joshua. That makes me feel great about even strength ice time, so I'm expecting top 6 minutes. And then we have the power play to talk about. Unfortunately, last season on the Bruins, Debrusk didn't get a lot of power play time, but on the Canucks, there is an open spot, and I think he has a very good chance to fill that role. With all this being said, let's take a look at his advanced stats. Last season, he had a 10.4% shooting percentage, and that was compared to a 12.4% career average. I'm expecting this to bounce back, and that is going to mean more goals for Debrusk. He only had 19 goals in 80 games last year, but the year prior, he had 27 goals in 64 games. That was in 22-23, and that was a 34 goal pace. The last thing I want to mention is that Debrusk puts up good peripherals, those peripherals being shots, hits, and blocks. If you are in a category league or a points league that values those, that might give him a slight edge against some other players. In conclusion, Debrusk going to the Canucks is awesome. I'm expecting to see a bump in even strength and power play time, specifically power play time. The Canucks are going to have a top 10 power play this year, in my opinion, and his ceiling is higher on this team than it was on the Bruins. I can go on, guys, but this move from the Bruins to the Canucks is great for his fantasy value. I expect him to be a sleeper this year, and there is a good chance that he bounces back in a big way. The next bounce back player we have to talk about is Matt Zuccarello of the Minnesota Wild. Now, Zuccarello definitely didn't have a bad season. He had 63 points in 69 games, which is a 82 game pace of 74 points, which is great, right? That is solid. The problem is that he only scored 12 goals in these 69 games. You guys can see right here with his shooting percentage. It was 6.9% last year compared to an 11.2% career average. That shooting percentage last season was the lowest shooting percentage of his entire NHL career. If we also look at his IPP as well, 62.22 compared to the last 3 years being 72.52, this suggests to me that he also got pretty unlucky. One thing that I really like about Zuccarello is his deployment. Last season, he had 18 minutes and 54 seconds of ice time per game, with 4 minutes and 1 second of this coming from the man advantage. The Wild had an amazing power play last year. It was 10th best in the NHL, and on this power play, Zuccarello put up 33 points. I'm expecting Zuccarello to be on this power play once again, and I'm expecting this power play to once again be a top 10 power play in the league. So for that reason, it's a pretty safe pick drafting Zuccarello. The only negatives I want to mention about Zuccarello is that there is a chance he's not playing with Kirill Kaprizov even strength. We saw that last year. They had a first line of Eriksson, Boldy, and Kaprizov. That was one of the best lines in the NHL. There's no guarantee that they run that line again, but yes, there could be a lot of games where Zuccarello and Kaprizov are not on the same line. That is one major concern about Zuccarello. I get it. He had more power play points last year than he had even strength points, and that is not ideal. Like I said, he had 33 power play points last year in 69 games, but that put him on pace for 39 power play points in a full season, and I don't know if that's sustainable. I say that, but then I look at his power play IPP from last season, and it was pretty much identical to the last 3 years, so we don't have a suggestion that this power play production is unsustainable in any way. So yeah, like regardless of those negatives, you still have to address that he's going to get elite deployment on a team that could have a top 10 power play once again. Ultimately, I'm expecting Zuccarello to bounce back in the goal scoring department. I think 20 to 25 goals and then 65 to 75 points is realistic. And this is a player that could go way later in drafts than he should. The only downside of Zuccarello is his shots, hits, and blocks. So if you're in a category league or a points league that heavily values those, I wouldn't necessarily reach on him in your drafts. But I think in a lot of formats, I'm going to be drafting him, and he'll probably provide a lot of upside from his ADP. The next bounce back player is Dylan Cozens of the Buffalo Sabres. He had a disappointing season last year, only scoring 18 goals and having a total of 47 points in 79 games. A big reason for this lack of production is that he was taken off the first line power play. That really hurt his fantasy value, but in my opinion, he's going to be back on the first unit this year, and he's probably going to provide a lot of upside in your upcoming drafts. If we look at his advanced stats here, starting with shooting percentage, his shooting percentage of 9% last year was lower than his career average of 10.4%. Not the biggest difference, guys, but 9% is pretty low, and I'm expecting his goal scoring to bounce back. If you look at on-ice shooting percentage as well, it was lower than it was in the last 3 seasons. Not only was Cozens struggling to score, but so was his line mates, so that's the reason for that. The other reasons why I'm bullish on Cozens for this year is, one, they have a new coaching staff. Lindy Ruff, new head coach. Seth Apper of the Rochester Americans is the assistant coach. I've heard good things about him and what he's going to do with the man advantage, so that excites me. Another reason why I like Cozens this year is that they have a lot of young players that could break out. players like Jack Quinn, players like J.J. Peterka, and overall, if these players do break out, it's going to help the offense. I also want to mention that the Sabres were not fully healthy last year. Jack Quinn only played a quarter of the season. Tage, Tuck, and Skinner all went through bouts of injury. If the Sabres manage to stay fully healthy with these young players breaking out, there is a lot of upside. And the last thing, and this could be the most important thing, is that in 22-23, the Sabres had the 9th best power play in the NHL. Last season in 23-24, they had the 4th worst power play in the NHL. I understand that there is expected regression from this power play, but that was way too much of a dip, and I'm expecting this power play to bounce back in a big way. I also wanted to mention that Cozens puts up solid shots and hits, so if you're in a category league or a points league that values those, it's definitely going to help his floor. The last thing I want to say is that ultimately Cozens' bounce back potential is going to be heavily dependent on him getting back on this first unit, and that is not necessarily a guarantee. Jack Quinn is absolutely a threat to be on the first unit over Cozens. Even though I'm projecting Cozens to be on there, that is something you need to consider, and that's why I would say you might want to proceed with caution just a little bit. Nonetheless, Cozens is still going to go super late in drafts, and if he is on this first unit, you could potentially see 30 goals and 60 plus points. The next bounce back player is Martin Necas of the Carolina Hurricanes. Necas had a disappointing season last year, only putting up 53 points in 77 games. And the reason that this was disappointing is because the season prior, he had 71 points. Last year was a season where he lost a minute of ice time per game, and he also got his power play points slashed in half. In 22-23, he was a staple on the first line power play, but not last season. No, he was usually on the second unit, and his fantasy relevance suffered because of that. Nonetheless, I think this year is going to look very different for Necas, and a big reason for this is because there are a ton of players that are no longer on the Carolina Hurricanes. Jake Guentzel didn't resign, Michael Bunting's on the Penguins, Teravainen went to the Blackhawks, and Evgeny Kuznetsov went to the KHL. Bunting, Teravainen, and Guentzel all got looks on the first line power play. And now with all of those players gone, there is a high likelihood that Necas is on this first unit. This is my projected power play for the upcoming season. And if you look at the second unit, there's not a lot of players that would be on the first unit over Necas. So in my opinion, Necas is a lock. Overall, power play deployment is the main driver of Necas' bounce back. And you could also see potentially the Canes running their first unit more than they did last season because they have way more talent on this first unit than the second. Like I said, Necas only had 13 power play points in 77 games last year, so I'm expecting this to go up to 20 plus. That will help his fantasy value. And also, if you look at his advanced stats, shooting percentage was down, on-ice shooting percentage was down, power play IPP was down. All of this signals to me that he should bounce back, and I think he could be a sleeper in your upcoming drafts. The only negative thing I want to say about Necas is that there is a chance he's playing with Jesperi Kotkaniemi even strength. Kotkaniemi could be centering that second line, and that is not necessarily ideal for fantasy production. Nonetheless, I do think they're going to mix up the lines quite a bit, so it could be Necas and Svechnikov on a line with Kotkaniemi, and then Bradley Nadeau would move up to play with Aho and Jarvis. But yeah, we're just going to have to see. I don't love the depth of the Canes this year. That's all I'm going to say. One final thing I want to say about Necas is that he has solid peripherals. He loves to shoot the puck, 231 shots in 77 games last year, 240 shots in 82 games a year prior, and he also puts up solid hits as well. So if you're in a league that values those categories, he's going to have a safe floor baked in. In conclusion, I think there's a good chance Necas bounces back, and 30 goals and 60 plus points is definitely a possibility. The next bounce back player we are talking about is Elias Lindholm of the Boston Bruins. Last season was a very disappointing season for Lindholm. He only had 15 goals and a total of 44 points in 75 games. We saw him on the Flames, and then at the trade deadline, he was traded to the Canucks. And on the Canucks, he wasn't great. I don't want to say too much about last season because this is a new year on a new team. But what I will say is that one, the Flames were a disaster last season, and two, Lindholm was dealing with injuries on the Canucks. Nonetheless, he's on a new team in the Bruins, signing with them during free agency, and in my opinion, this is a fantastic landing spot for Lindholm. There is a very good chance that Lindholm is on the first line with Pastrnak, even strength, and then in my opinion, he is pretty much a lock to be on this first power play unit as well. The Bruins had the 14th best power play in the league last year, so it's definitely a solid landing spot going to the Bruins if we're talking about power play point potential. And I just think that with the potential of him playing with Pastrnak, even strength, and on the man advantage, that there is a lot of upside for a player that could probably go super late in your drafts. If we take a look at his advanced stats here, we could see with the shooting percentage, it was very low. This was the lowest shooting percentage since the 2016-2017 season for Lindholm. So yes, I'm expecting this to bounce back, and I think Lindholm is going to score more goals this year. If we also take a look at on-ice shooting percentage, last year it was 9.73% compared to the last 3 seasons where it was 12.2%. With that being said, guys, Lindholm is really good when it comes to shots, hits, and blocks. He's a guy that's going to get really good deployment on the Bruins. I'm expecting 19 plus minutes per game, very good power play time as well, and he is going to a team where he could be stapled to David Pastrnak, even strength and on-the-man advantage as well. So yeah, I'm expecting Lindholm to bounce back, and I'm expecting 60+ points. Next up, we got to talk about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins of the Edmonton Oilers. Listen, I understand that Nugent-Hopkins was due to regress last season, and he regressed quite a bit, but now I'm expecting him to bounce back. And Ryan Nugent-Hopkins was a player that I definitely wasn't targeting last season. I knew regression was coming because last season he had the highest shooting percentage of his career at 18.4%. He scored 37 goals. That was the highest of his career, and obviously he put up 104 points. I knew that this was not sustainable, and what we got last season was definitely too much in the other direction. He only scored 18 goals with a 9.8% shooting percentage, and that was the lowest shooting percentage since the 2016-2017 season. Nugent-Hopkins also didn't put up a lot of power play points either. He put up 26 power play points in 80 games, and that was his lowest power play point pace since the 2017-2018 season. These two things are backed up by his advanced stats here, his shooting percentage being lower than his career average by a decent amount, and also his power play IPP being fairly lower than the last 3 years. The fact is with Nugent-Hopkins is that he's playing even strength and on-the-man advantage with the best player in the world in Connor McDavid. Some people might think that Victor Arvidsson or Jeff Skinner could hurt Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in fantasy this season, but I just don't see how that would be the case. Nugent-Hopkins, Zach Hyman, and Connor McDavid was the most played line last year, and I think they're going to keep that line together. There is a tiny sliver that Jeff Skinner or Victor Arvidsson could take Nugent-Hopkins off the first line power play, but personally, I highly doubt that happens. Overall, I think he's going to be solid value. I think he's going to bounce back, and I like his fantasy outlook for this year. The next bounce back player on this list is Mika Zibanejad of the New York Rangers. Last season was not the best year for Zibanejad, only putting up 26 goals and a total of 72 points in 81 games. This was Zibanejad's worst goal pace since the 2016-2017 season. So yes, he was not scoring goals last year, and he was not great even strength. Now, I do have some concerns with Zibanejad. I'm not fully convinced he is going to bounce back in a major way, but we do have some advanced stats that suggest to us that he will. If we look at his shooting percentage, 11.8% last year compared to a 13.2% career average, this was his worst shooting percentage since joining the Rangers. So yeah, it was his worst shooting percentage in a long time. You can also look at his IPP numbers, and you can see that they were much lower than the last 3 years. This was the case for both 5v5 and on the man advantage, but it was specifically bad 5v5. It was 20% less than it was in the last 3 years. So this could suggest to us that maybe he was just getting unlucky. With that being said, I do have some concerns about Zibanejad still. He is 31 years old, and he relied on power play goals and power play points a lot in the last 2 seasons. So I don't love that. And then even strength, he's playing on a line with Chris Kreider and new addition Riley Smith. They don't necessarily have an elite playmaker to feed Zibanejad on that line, so I don't love that, but you could argue that Riley Smith is an upgrade over the players that they tried putting on that line last season. If you look at the lines last year, the most consistent line was Lafreniere, Trocheck, and Panarin. That was by far the line that was played the most, so they're going to keep that together. It worked very well last season. And then with Zibanejad and Kreider, they were trying Blake Wheeler, they were trying Cabo Caco, they were trying Filipino, they were trying Jack Roslovich. They were trying to make stuff work, and ultimately, it wasn't. In conclusion, Zibanejad's advanced stats suggest to me that there is bounce back potential. He still has elite deployment on a team with the 3rd best power play in the NHL last season, and also 7th in goals per game in the NHL last season. So he's in an elite offense, and we've seen in the past his ability to score a lot of goals. So yeah, there is a chance that he could be good value in your upcoming drafts, but there's also a chance that he's still a power play merchant that doesn't find chemistry with new addition Riley Smith. The next player that has a good chance of bouncing back is Tim Stutzle of the Ottawa Senators. Stutzle did not have a great season last year. He only scored 18 goals in 75 games with a total of 70 points. That was compared to the year prior, where he scored 39 goals and a total of 90 points in 78 games. Now, this goal scoring drop was definitely tough to see, but looking back at it now, it probably should have been expected. He had a 17.1% shooting percentage in that year. He scored 39 goals, and that was not sustainable. This is why you have to look at advanced stats, and that's something that I really didn't do last season, and that was a huge mistake on my end. I feel like I was a novice last year, and some of my takes were not based on actually looking at the data. This production from 22-23 was screaming regression, and I should have known that. Nonetheless, this year is a different season, and now we can see it going in the other direction. Stutzle's shooting percentage was 9.4% compared to his 12.9% career average, so I'm expecting this goal scoring to bounce back. Now, if you look at the other advanced stats, it doesn't necessarily scream bounce back to me, so I do want to say that I'm not projecting Stutzle to have some sort of monster season. I'm just projecting him to score more goals. What I really love about Stutzle is that he's only 22 years old, and the type of season season that he put up at 21 years old is very impressive. So there's always upside with his age and the fact that he could take another step forward. I also love his deployment. 21 minutes and 7 seconds of ice time per game last year was 10th in the NHL. That is elite. I also want to mention that his peripherals are really solid if your league counts hits. He put up 100 hits last year and 41 blocks, which is good. Shots are not the best. I would like to see him shoot the puck a little bit more, but still, all things considered, he might have a safe floor baked in when you draft him if your league values hits. There's also two more things I wanted to mention about Stutzle, which helps his upside case. And those things are, one, the Senators dealt with a lot of injuries last year. You had Shane Pinto miss half of the year. You had Josh Norris have to have shoulder surgery. And you also had Thomas Chabot missing a lot of games as well. So you had three key players not with the team for the entire season, and that definitely impacted the production of Stutzle and some other players as well. The second thing is that even though Stutzle had really good power play time, there were times where he was on the second unit and the Senators were running distributed usage for both power play units. That is not good for fantasy, and with a new head coach, that could potentially change. To be honest though, I'm not the biggest fan of new head coach Travis Green. I don't like what he's done with special teams in the past, and he doesn't have the greatest history of coaching in the NHL. So yeah, I do want to say that. I also wanted to mention about the power play is that in 22-23, the Senators had the 8th best power play in the NHL, and then last season it was the 10th worst. So maybe this season you can find a middle ground. In conclusion, guys, I think Stutzle is going to bounce back in the goal scoring department, and there is some upside here with the power play potentially improving and the Senators staying healthy. I do want to say though, I am not that high on Stutzle, okay? I think 80 points is a realistic projection for him, and I do worry that he might be a little bit too pricey with his ADP. I think people are going to be hyping him up a little bit more, and I'm not sure if he can get back to the type of production that we saw in 22-23 because his advanced stats suggested to me that that was not sustainable. The next bounce back player on this list is Cole Caufield of the Montreal Canadiens. To be honest, guys, I was a fan of Caufield going into last season, and looking back at it, it was very stupid because his stats were screaming regression. Last year, I really didn't look at advanced stats, and I feel like this year I know 10 times more than I did last season, so I'm not going to make that mistake again. With that being said, we saw the regression hit, but it swung way too far in the other direction, so now he's due for a bounce back. Last season, he had an 8.9% shooting percentage, which was the lowest of his NHL career and much lower than his career average. So yes, I'm expecting this to regress to the mean, and that means Caufield is going to score more goals. Like I said before, just because his shooting percentage is lower than his career average doesn't mean there's a guarantee it's going to bounce back. But yes, it is a good indication, and we can also look at his power play IPP and see that it was much lower than it was in the last couple of years. His power play IPP being fairly low suggests to me that he may have been getting unlucky on the man advantage, so there is a possibility that we see a bump in power play points. Caufield's production last year was obviously disappointing, but one thing I did love is that he put up 314 shots. If you're in a league that counts shots, which most leagues do, this gives Caufield a massive advantage against his competition because he has that safe floor baked in. This will give Caufield an edge against players like Braden Point, who might only put up 210 shots in a season compared to Caufield, who's putting up 300 plus. By no means am I saying that Caufield's going to be better than Point in fantasy, but his shot volume helps quite a bit in most leagues. With the shots that Caufield put up, he was 9th in shots per game among forwards, only behind Nylander, Forsberg, Eichel, Brady Tkachuk, Jack Hughes, Austin Matthews, David Pastrnak, and Nathan McKinnon. That is absolutely elite. I also want to state some obvious stuff, and that is the fact that he is only 23 years old, so he has room for growth in his career, and he's also a player that gets elite deployment on the first line and the first line power play. Caufield averaged 19 minutes and 25 seconds of ice time per game, which is very good, and they also run heavy usage for their first unit. So he got 3 minutes and 35 seconds per game on the man advantage. This is all great stuff, but I do have to talk about one potential negative. That negative is Patrik Laine joining the Canadiens. Now, this isn't necessarily a negative. In fact, it could be a positive, and I'll give you that argument. But the main problem is that Laine normally plays on the left side on the power play, and that is the same spot that Caufield plays on the power play. Some would argue that Laine not being on the first line power play would be a huge mistake because yes, he is a power play specialist, and yes, he is a very good one-time threat on that left side. The problem is that the Canadiens recognize this to be the case and they put him on the first unit. This is going to move Caufield out of his natural spot on the left side, and that would mean that Caufield is no longer the #1 scoring option on the man advantage. They would likely move Caufield to the bumper, and that's okay. Like, there's plenty of players that score a lot of goals in the power play in the bumper. Sam Reinhart and Braden Point come to mind, but there is a concern for me that this does hurt Caufield's ability to score on the man advantage. The flip side argument is that Laine goes on this power play and improves the power play, because last season the Canadiens had the 6th worst power play percentage in the NHL. If this power play improves, then yes, it does help Caufield's fantasy outlook. That is one argument to make. Ultimately, I can't know for sure what the Canadiens are going to do with the power play and how this is going to change the dynamic, but we do have to consider those implications when talking about Caufield and fantasy. So I thought I would talk about it, but I can't say that it's going to positively or negatively affect him just yet. In conclusion, guys, I still really like Caufield for this year. His advanced stats suggested me bounce back potential. He was 9th in shots per game, like I said earlier, which is absolutely elite. And he has the ability to potentially score 35 plus goals this year. The next bounce back player we have to talk about is John Tavares of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I know some people think Tavares is cooked, but I think that his advanced stats show me that he is going to bounce back and potentially bounce back in a big way. Last season, John Tavares had a 10.4% shooting percentage compared to a 12.8% career average. And guess what, guys? This was the lowest shooting percentage of his entire career. We can also see that his on-ice shooting percentage was much lower than the last 3 seasons. And also his power play IPP was much lower than it was in the last 3 years. And now if you look at his overall IPP, so 5v5, power play, and other situations, he had the 2nd lowest IPP of his career. All this suggests to me that Tavares was getting unlucky last year and that his stats should regress to the mean. John Tavares is still getting top 6 minutes, playing even strength with William Nylander, and on one of the best power plays in the NHL. Tavares is also a player that puts up elite shots and hits. Last season, he had 279 shots in 80 games, and he was 17th in shots per game in the NHL. He also put up 134 hits last year, which is extremely good for a player that puts up his amount of points. It's hard to find guys that put up this level of points with that hit production, so he is going to be super valuable in those leagues. In terms of some other advanced stats, he was 4th in ISCF per 60, which is individual scoring chances, only behind Austin Matthews, Zach Hyman, and Jake Gensel. He was also 24th in ICF per 60, which is any shot attempt on the goalie, and he was 20th in shots, hits, and blocks among forwards. Ultimately, guys, I'm liking what I'm seeing with his advanced stats. I like the situation that he's in on the Leafs, and this is a player that saw his value go down from the year prior, so he's going to go later in drafts than he probably should, and he could end up being fantastic value in your upcoming drafts. The next bounce back player is Tage Thompson of the Buffalo Sabres. Thompson was extremely disappointing last season. He was a guy that was a top 20 pick in a lot of leagues, and he cost people their fantasy hockey leagues. There's no question about it. He only had 29 goals and a total of 56 points in 71 games, and that was a far cry from the year prior. The year prior, in 22-23, he put up 47 goals and a total of 94 points in 78 games. I don't know if he is going to put up that type of production again, but I do think that this season there's a strong chance that he bounces back. Looking at his advanced stats here, starting with shooting percentage, yes, his shooting percentage last year wasn't much lower than his career average, but if we compare his shooting percentage last season to the 2 years before that, then it starts to look a little bit better for a bounce back. These other advanced stats suggest bounce back potential to me as well. His on-ice shooting percentage was much lower than the last 3 years. His 5v5 individual points percentage was much lower than it was in the last 3 years, and his power play IPP was also much lower than it was in the last 3 seasons too. When I say much lower, I don't mean by a crazy amount, but still, all of this indicates to me that there is room for him to bounce back. The biggest thing I want to talk about when it comes to the Sabres and Tage Thompson bouncing back is the man advantage. Last season, they had the 4th worst power play in the NHL, but the year prior, it was the 9th best. They fired their head coach, Granato, who was making some very stupid power play decisions last season, and now they have Lindy Ruff coming in, and also Seth Apper as the assistant coach. I've heard good things about Seth Apper and what he wants to do with the special teams, so yeah, I think this is going to be a huge factor in Thompson bouncing back. Thompson only had 16 power play points last season, so yes, if this power play can be a top 15 or even a top 20 power play, we are going to see him perform better than last season. Another thing I want to mention is his shots. He was 13th in shots per 60 last season. He has 300 shot potential, so yeah, that is obviously massive in fantasy. Like I just talked about with Caufield, he is a guy that can score 40 plus goals. I also want to mention that the Sabres have some elite young players that could easily take a step forward this upcoming season. You have Owen Power, Rasmus Dahlin, Bowen Byram, JJ Peterka, Jack Quinn, Zach Benson. The list goes on, guys. You have so many young talented players that could improve, and if they do, that is going to help the Sabres offense, and it's definitely going to help their power play as well. All things considered, guys, Thompson has a lot of upside. He's going to get elite deployment on the first line and the first line power play, a power play that should improve, and he could end up being good value in your upcoming drafts. The next bounce back player on this list is Jason Robertson of the Dallas Stars. Going into last season, Robertson was coming off a 46 goal and 109 point campaign, but ultimately he disappointed, only putting up 29 goals and a total of 80 points in 82 games. Last season, we also saw Shot volume go way down, going from 313 shots in 22-23 to only 231 shots last season. I didn't love that, but nonetheless, I do think he is going to bounce back, and let's break down his advanced stats. If we look at his shooting percentage, it was 12.6% compared to a 14.9% career average, and that 12.6% shooting percentage was the lowest shooting percentage of his NHL career. We can also look at his 5v5 IPP being only 65.15% last year, which was much lower than the last 3 years. This could have been due to a number of reasons, but there is a chance that he was getting unlucky even strength. Another very important thing that we have to talk about when discussing even strength is Joe Pavelski. In years past, the Robertson, Hintz, Pavelski line was one of the best lines in the NHL, and at times it looked absolutely unstoppable. Unfortunately, Father Time spares no one, and he noticeably declined last year. I think that's a big reason as to why players like Robertson and Hintz struggled last year, but the good thing is that they have a new line mate this year with Pavelski retiring, and that could potentially help their fantasy production. Now, do we know which line mate they are going to have? No, we don't know that just yet. They seem pretty adamant at keeping Wyatt Johnson at center, which I don't love because I would love to see Johnson, Robertson, and Hintz on a line. But if that's the case, it's probably going to be either Logan Stankoven, Tyler Seguin, or maybe somebody else. Regardless, guys, you're not going to have a noticeably declining 40-year-old holding down Robertson and Hintz this season, and that means that there could be some upside from their ADP. Now, the only negative I want to talk about when it comes to the Stars is I hated the usage that they ran with their power play units last year. Now, since Robertson's been on the Stars, there's never been elite usage for the first unit, but last year it was noticeably bad. Like, they were running the second unit way more than they normally do, sometimes having the second unit be the first unit and the first unit be the second unit. Now, I get why they did this. There were times where the second unit was way better than the first, but ultimately that hurt players like Robertson and Hintz in fantasy, and I really hope that doesn't happen again. If you look at power play time percentage last year, it was 60.4% for Robertson, which isn't great, but even lower for Roope Hintz, which was 56.5%. I do have some concerns they're going to run similar usages on the power play this year, which is why I don't know how high of a ceiling Robertson has. They still have Duchesne, Sagan, Stankoven, and others on that second unit, so they may run their second unit more than some other teams do. We also have to recognize that DeBoer loves to spread around the offense even strength as well. They don't run top heavy minutes for their first line guys. No, they give good minutes to the second and third line guys as well, and that will cap their ceiling too. Those are the negatives that I had to address with Robertson, and it does make me unsure that he's going to get back to being a 100-point player again, but regardless, I'm still expecting his bounce back potential to be strong this year, and there is a chance he puts up 90+ points. The number 2 player on this list is Matthew Tkachuk of the Florida Panthers. Now, this one's pretty simple, guys. Tkachuk last season, he had a 9.3% shooting percentage compared to a career average of 12.6%, and that 9.3 shooting percentage was the lowest shooting percentage since his rookie season in 2016-2017. Another important thing here is Tkachuk's power play goals. Last season, he only had 6 power play goals, which was tied second for the lowest power play goal pace of his entire career. His power play IPP of 62.75% was definitely lower than the last 3 years as well, so there could be some room for growth on the man advantage. Other things that I love about Tkachuk in fantasy is that he has elite deployment, top 6 minutes, and on the first line power play, heavy usage for that first unit. In fact, he was tied 7th in power play time per game last year, so that was great. And also his peripherals too. He puts up elite shots. He has 300+ shot potential with really good hits as well, so if your league counts those, he's going to be very valuable. All things considered, Tkachuk is a strong bounce back candidate. He put up 100+ points in 2 of the last 3 years, and there's a chance he does it once again. The number 1 bounce back player on this list is Jack Hughes of the New Jersey Devils. Now, with Jack Hughes, it's not like he had a bad season last year. He was on pace for 35 goals and 97 points, which is elite, but there are a couple of reasons why I expect him to bounce back, so let's break it down. Now, when I'm talking about bounce back, I'm specifically talking about his goal scoring. Last year, he only put up 27 goals in 62 games, like I said, a 35 goal pace, but in the 2 years prior, his goal pace was 45 and 43. Last season, Hughes had a 9.9% shooting percentage compared to an 11% career average. No, this is not the biggest difference, but we do have to recognize that this career average is taken into account his first 2 years in the NHL, where he had a 5 and 7% shooting percentage. So if you take those seasons out, yes, 9.9% is pretty low. His other stats don't scream bounce back to me, but I'm expecting him to score more goals. That's the reason why he's a bounce back candidate. He has the ability to put up 40+ goals, and we didn't see that from him last year. Now, the biggest reason why I think he's a bounce back candidate that we haven't discussed yet is the fact that he was battling injuries all season long last year, and then eventually had to get shoulder surgery. If you guys don't remember, at the start of the year, Hughes was putting up historic numbers. He had 13 goals and 10 assists for a total of 23 points in his first 13 games. Unfortunately, very soon after that in November, he was injured, and when he came back, he was not the same player. That being said, if he is fully healthy for this upcoming year, we could see potentially monster numbers. The fact is that Hughes could potentially put up 50 plus goals, 100 plus points, and 300 plus shots in fantasy next year. So yeah, he would be absolutely game breaking in fantasy, and he might be going at the end of the first round. I also wanted to mention that Jack Hughes had 4.42 shots per game last year, which was 4th in the entire NHL. That is absolutely elite. And we also have to talk about the fact that his power play point potential is super high too. Hughes was on pace for 41 power play points last year, which is of the absolute best in the NHL. And this was a year where he was injured, and also a year where Hamilton was injured as well. So there's just so much upside here, and there's also a bunch of young players on the Devils that could break out and take a step forward, ultimately helping the Devils offense. So yeah, I can go on, but I just want to say that he has a good chance at bouncing back. He has a lot of upside, and I'm super excited to see what he can do this year. Now that we've talked about forwards, I just want to talk about a couple of defensemen that I think have good chances to bounce back, starting with Justin Faulk of the St. Louis Blues. For me, this is very obvious, guys. Faulk only had 2 goals in 60 games last year. His shooting percentage was 1.5%, the lowest of his entire NHL career, and that was compared to a 5.8% career average. We can also see that his on-ice shooting percentage was really low compared to the last 3 years. So yeah, I'm liking what I'm seeing with these advanced stats. And I also want to say that Faulk is a guy that puts up amazing shots, hits, or blocks. So if you're in a category league or a points league that values those, he is at a massive advantage. The last thing that I want to say is that Krug is officially out for the entire 24-25 season. So they have to find a new power play 1 quarterback. Is it going to be Faulk? I don't know. It's not a guarantee. He is going to be in competition with players like Broberg, Peronovich, Leddy, etc. But there is a chance that we do see improved power play time from Faulk, and that is obviously going to help his fantasy value. The next bounce back defenseman I want to talk about is Seth Jones of the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, Jones didn't have a terrible year last year. He was on pace for almost 10 goals and a total of 37 points, so it's not like that was a bad season. But the problem with his perceived value going into this season is that there were periods last season where he wasn't on the first unit. If you own Jones in fantasy, that was definitely concerning, and we do have to address the fact that his pace of 37 points this year was the lowest it has been on the Chicago Blackhawks. Regardless of this, we do have to address some of his advanced stats, specifically his IPP. If we look both even strength and power play, especially on the power play, it was much lower than it was in the previous 3 seasons, and that suggests to me that he may have been getting unlucky. We also have to address the fact that the Blackhawks had an absolutely terrible roster last year. Yes, Bedard, potential generational talent, but you had guys like Ryan Donato, Philip Kurashev, and Jason Dickinson in your top 6. That is bad. With that being said, you have second-year Bedard and the Blackhawks going out and getting Teuvo Teravainen and Tyler Bertuzzi, so their offense should be better. Ultimately, what I love about Jones is that he averaged 25 minutes and 29 seconds of ice time per game last year. He was 8th in shots per game amongst defensemen, 28th in shots, hits, and blocks combined amongst defensemen, and he is likely going to be on the first unit with Bedard, Teravainen, and Bertuzzi for this upcoming year. I also forgot to mention that Taylor Hall missed most of last season, so yes, this offense is going to get better, and that is going to help Seth Jones. In conclusion, Jones should bounce back. He should be getting great deployment with elite peripherals, and you're probably going to be able to snag him super late in your drafts. The next bounce back defenseman is Mikhail Sergachev of the Utah Hockey Club. Now, this one's pretty obvious, guys. On the Lightning, he wasn't able to outcompete Hedman for that first unit spot, but on the Utah Hockey Club, he has a much better shot. We also have to talk about the fact that he broke his leg last year, only playing 34 games, and also his advanced stats suggest that he should bounce back too. If we look at shooting percentage last year, he was 3.8%. That was the second lowest of his NHL career, and that is compared to a 5.6% career average. I'm expecting this to regress to the mean. These other advanced stats don't necessarily scream bounce back potential, but his power play IPP was lower than it was in the last 3 years considerably, so maybe he was getting unlucky on there a little bit. But regardless of that, guys, what I want to see here from him is getting on the first line power play, a power play that was 15th best in the NHL last season. Now listen, I want you guys to know that I don't know what's going to happen with this power play. I think there is a 50-50 shot on who runs his first unit. It's either going to be Durzi or Sergachev. The case for Durzi is that Durzi was great on there and they had the 15th best power play in the NHL, so why mix it up? But the case for Sergachev is that, in my opinion, he is better and he is a better fit to be on this unit. We will see what happens with the power play, but I really like his shots, hits, and blocks. I think he's very talented offensively, and he has that upside potentially going to the first unit. So yeah, he's a strong bounce back candidate. The number 1 bounce back defenseman on this list is Erik Karlsson of the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is another situation where the regression that was expected to hit swung way too far in the other direction, and now we could potentially see him bounce back. If we look at his shooting percentage, it was 5.2% compared to a 6.8% career average average, so a solid difference that could regress to the mean. And then with his IPP as well, there is an argument to say that he got unlucky last year. His 5v5 IPP was much lower than the last 3 years, and his power play IPP wasn't great either. Another big reason I think he's going to bounce back is that Karlsson had to adjust to a new team last season, a new system, and sometimes that takes time. Karlsson has now had a year under his belt to adjust to this new system, and also they are bringing in the previous head coach for the Sharks who coached Karlsson during his Norris campaign, David Quinn. Quinn is their new assistant coach, and maybe that could help with Karlsson's production. He's going to be in charge of special teams, and that's a big factor into whether Karlsson has a big season. It's going to be the power play. The Penguins had the third worst power play in the NHL last season, only behind the Flyers and the Blue Jackets. So that's why there is upside to Karlsson in fantasy, because if they can figure out this power play, his numbers could go way up. With that being said, that's also the potential negative for Karlsson. If this power play stays the same and it stays bad, then no, Karlsson has no chance of putting up 70 plus points. In conclusion, there's a lot of different reasons as to why Karlsson could bounce back this year. I'm very excited to see what he can do. I really hope the Penguins can figure out their power play, and Karlsson might end up being really good value in your upcoming drafts. One last bonus defenseman I want to talk about is Dougie Hamilton of the New Jersey Devils. Hamilton's advanced stats don't scream bounce back, and the reason for this is because in the small sample size that we have from last year, in 20 games, he put up 5 goals and a total of 16 points. He also had 8 power play points in these 20 games, which is why his power play IPP is so high. So no, he's not technically bouncing back from last year, because in the games that he played, he was really good. Nonetheless, the reason that he's a bounce back defenseman is because he lost a lot of perceived value going into the season with not being on the first line power play to start the year. A lot of people are under the wrong assumption that the only reason Hamilton wasn't on the first unit is because he got injured, but that is not the case. Luke Hughes was put on the first unit, and during that first month, they were putting up historic numbers, and they had the best power play in the NHL. With that being said though, I think there is a good chance Hamilton gets back on this first unit, and he's definitely going to go later in your drafts, so you may end up being really good value. The reasons why I think Hamilton has a good shot of getting back on this first unit is because currently, with Luke Hughes on the first power play, they have 5 lefties. This can be super predictable on the man advantage, and I think later on in the season, you saw teams start to figure out Luke Hughes. The fact is that Hamilton is a much needed right-hand player on this unit, and I think it's going to help the predictability that we saw later on in the year. I also want to mention that Hamilton's shot is very powerful and very advantageous on the man advantage. Teams respect the ability for Hamilton to let shots go and open more lanes. There is just much more space on the man advantage with Hamilton on it, and Luke Hughes doesn't necessarily have that shot at this point in his career. That's another reason why this power play can be predictable with Luke Hughes on it, because he doesn't have that threat from the point. With that being said, there is no guarantee Hamilton makes it back on the first unit. That is just my opinion, and I think there's a strong chance it happens. There's still a massive risk when drafting Dougie Hamilton because we don't know what's going to happen with this power play, and they could easily still have Jack and Luke together. With that being said though, Hamilton is going to go later in drafts than he did last season, and if he ends up on this first unit, the upside is insane. In conclusion, I'm still going to be drafting my fair share of Hamilton this year because there is that upside baked in. All right, guys, that is the end of the video. Hit that like button if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I will catch you in the next one.